Hey, what's up everybody? George here, and winter's almost over and spring is on the horizon, so I better start building this T-Rex 450 Super Sport combo. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to do a step-by-step build video. There are too many of them out there on the web that are much better than I could ever do. Really, this is going to be more of a progress video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the instruction book. I'm going to build each section. And as I build each part, I'll stop, do a little conversation on how the build went, any things that I learned or discovered while I was building it. And then hopefully by the end of the video, we'll have a completely built helicopter that we're ready to go out and fly. Everything I've heard about this bird is it's very, very easy to assemble if you simply follow the instructions. You're going to need some tools, of course, some hex wrenches. A caliper is a good thing to have so you can set your link lengths, but I'm real anxious to get started with this build, so I'm going to start with the head, which is the very first thing in the manual, and as soon as I've got it built, we'll go ahead and discuss that a little bit. So, on to the build. Okay, so here we have the completed head assembly. The assembly was pretty straightforward. I followed the instructions step by step. Essentially what they had you do was build the flybar cage and install it in the flybar and the paddles. Build the links and install those, install the swash plate, and that's pretty much it. But one thing I wanted to remind you is that before you start the build, systematically go through and Loctite every single bolt that goes into metal. I did find several of them that didn't have Loctite, so I made sure, and now I have a little peace of mind that they're all done. Make sure you Loctite all the balls as well. Every single one of those, starting at the top going down to the bottom, I Loctited all of those. Making these links, well, it was pretty easy. I used my caliper. I made them to the length specified in the manual. It was no big deal. A lot of the links are fixed. You don't even have to worry about adjusting them. The assembly went pretty smooth. Absolutely no problems. The instructions were clear. I did use some of the videos online to help guide me through the process, but overall it went smoothly and I'm ready to move on to the frame. Okay, here you have the completed frame sub-assembly, and it was pretty straightforward to assemble. I simply followed the instructions in the book. No surprises. Everything went according to plan. I had absolutely no issues. I did do a couple things that I will discuss right now. The first being I went ahead and took a piece of sandpaper and I sanded the edges off of all this carbon fiber here. It was a little sharp. I really didn't want to cut my hands on it. It only took a second. Another thing I did a little bit differently is I installed the motor on the motor mount before I put it into the lower frame. It was a little bit easier to get the bolts in, and I can still get to the bolts from the top with no problem to adjust the motor back and forth. Another thing is make sure that you Loctite any bolts that are going into metal, such as the bolts going into these bearing holders, the bolts going into the motor mount. There's a metal bar in the back here, the bolts going into the metal bar. You want to make sure that you Loctite all of those after you're done assembling it. You do have to put in the gyro tray, which is no problem, self-tapping screws. Same thing with the anti-rotation slider, self-tapping screws, pop it in. It wasn't a big deal at all. Once again, I didn't Loctite anything. What I'll do is I'll take my shaft, put it down in, make sure everything lines up. Then I'll systematically go from one end to the other and Loctite everything down. Another thing you want to pay attention to is the orientation of the wires coming off the back of the motor. You'll want to have them coming off to the side, just like I do here. I kind of went online and I found pictures of how other people did it, and it was a little ambiguous in the instructions, but that's the way it's got to be. So the next thing I'm going to do is assemble the landing gear and then put the landing gear on the bottom of the frame. So let's go ahead and get right onto that. Okay, I've assembled the landing gear and attached it to the frame. I simply followed the instructions once again in the manual. Very straightforward. No surprises, nothing out of the ordinary. Basically what they had you do was assemble the landing gear struts to the landing gear pipe, thread through your stops. I put them on the inside so they wouldn't fall out. There's 4 little grub screws in here that hold it in. No Loctite necessary on those. The landing gear attaches to the frame with 4 self-tappers. No Loctite necessary on that. And that pretty much finishes the frame assembly. This is a good point to move on to the next video, which will be starting with the tail. But before I move on to the next video, there's a couple things I wanted to point out I didn't mention before. And the first is that the motor pinion gear, where it goes onto the shaft, there is no flat. You'll want to take a file and flatten out that shaft where the grub screw for the pinion gear holds it to the shaft, and you'll definitely want to Loctite that as well. I did want to mention that. One other thing I wanted to mention is with the head, and that is you definitely want to grease the thrust bearings. I didn't mention it, but I did do it. What you want to do is take off the blade holders, get down to the thrust bearing, put a little grease on it. I actually put a little grease on the bearing races as well, and then put the feathering shaft back together. And of course, remember that you wanna Loctite the bolts back into that feathering shaft when you're done. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and call this video a wrap and get ready to start with the assembly number 2. Look forward for that one, and we'll be starting with the tail. Thanks for watching, everybody, and happy flying.